Steroids don't work unless you do, bro. Natty guys are just lazy. That's why they aren't jacked like me. They only make you 10% stronger, guys. Science. I mean, in reality, they barely do anything. That's why I go through the trouble of pinning them in my ass every week. It's just TRT!
What's up, guys? Enkiri here, and today I want to talk a little bit about everyone's favorite topic, PEDs. See, it's become fashionable in recent years for many fitness industry figureheads who've been on steroids since the day they finished puberty to discuss the potential impact of these drugs. And very often, it seems that these same people want to tell us that these drugs play only a modest role in someone's strength and hypertrophy development. Basically, they have a built-in incentive to downplay their effectiveness, right? And it makes sense why somebody in that position would do this, would downplay the effectiveness of PEDs, because the more impactful that people think that these drugs are, then the less impressive and the less knowledgeable that those same jacked gurus will seem in comparison, right? If people think that PEDs are super strong and super potent, then it's primarily the drugs that help those people achieve their superior results and not their superior knowledge bases or their superior work ethics, right? Whereas on the other hand, if people think that PEDs are only modestly or moderately or maybe even mildly effective, then the knowledge bases of those same jacked, roided out gurus retain their value and their meaning. So again, it makes sense why somebody who's on these drugs would make these types of assertions and these types of arguments, just as it makes sense why somebody who isn't on them would argue the counterpoint. And that's pretty much exactly what I'm guilty of here today. Now, before I jump into the meat of things here, though, I do like to point out that I'm not a doctor, I'm not a researcher or a data analyst or an exercise scientist of any sort, right? I don't pore over data, and I don't make it a habit of perusing the literature either. By and large, I don't much care about the science of exercise, so make of that whatever you want. What I will say is, I do have two eyes and a few brain cells that I rub together sometimes. And with my two eyes and my brain cells, I like to make observations every now and then, right? And every now and then, the assertions that those authorities shout at me seem highly incongruent with the observations that my eyes are somehow able to plainly see. And the phenomenon of downplaying the effectiveness of PEDs is one such case of that happening. So we have people in a position that's effectively a conflict of interest, arguing their interests by downplaying the potential effectiveness of performance-enhancing drugs. And no one really seems to argue back against it, I guess because the people who are often making these assertions are considered credentialed authorities, right? They're smarter than us. They know things that we don't know. So, kind of in the spirit of using my two eyes to make observations rather than using data to support a theory. Now remember, there are lies, there are damned lies, and then there are statistics. So instead of using data to argue a theory, I want to give you guys my perspective on the PED effectiveness debate. And I want to do that in a very simple way. Simply by highlighting two prominent examples of heavy PED usage. Guys who are on these drugs for a very long period of time, who experienced phenomenal results with them, and then subsequently went off of them. And the two people that pop into the forefront of my mind in this regard are the famed Olympic weightlifter Xiaojun, who last year was on an extended PED hiatus, and prominent powerlifter Pete Rubish, who's documented every step of his journey of PED cessation right here on YouTube. Now, if we look at Lou, I actually made a video covering his regression last year when footage of him first started getting published on the Xiaojun YouTube channel. And on there, in 2022, we were treated to footage of Lou, the once inhuman monster, doing things like struggling to squat 150 kilograms, that's 330 pounds. Barely pulling 170 kilograms or 374 pounds off the floor. Struggling with a sub 4 plate deadlift, a weight that is less than what he has officially snatched in competition. We also saw him performing some tricky snatch doubles with 90 kilograms, which is a weight that's a little bit less than 200 pounds. Now, and basically we saw this initial comeback footage of Lou, and not only were the weights that he was using incredibly human, incredibly average, they were actually even quite paltry as well. Some might say pedestrian. Not something that you would expect to see from one of the greatest weightlifters to ever walk the planet. Barely even past his prime, irrespective of a length of training hiatus that he may have been on. And if I do recall correctly, it was stated around that time that Lou had taken something like a year off of training after the 2021 Tokyo Olympics, an event which he had won in near top form. And then the next time that we saw him in 2022, I think it was like a little less than a year later, he was barely picking up off of the floor a weight that he had just snatched a few months prior. He also looked like he donated all of his muscle to the sarcopenia clinic in a tremendous act of charity. But what really happened was that he stopped training and he stopped taking his performance enhancing drugs as well. Now, I will say, we didn't really get to see any true maxes when Lou was in his weakest state, although we did come pretty close to seeing what he was capable of. He was using very average weights and he was struggling with them enough to see that we weren't all that far away from the ceiling, right? So here's a guy who at his peak back squats nearly 300 kilograms. That's well over 600 pounds, 660 pounds. He routinely front squats 240 kg. That is 529 pounds. And he does that just 3 days before his nationals weightlifting competition. And he can heave 150 kilograms, basically somewhere in the mid 300 pounds, right? Or higher, even higher than that potentially, from the floor straight overhead in one fell swoop. And he does that day in and day out for a living when he is at his peak or when he is close to his peak, right? But just after 1 year off, not even 1 year off from the steroids, his strength had been almost cut in half. Right? He lost something like 30 to 40% off many of his numbers during the initial phases of his comeback. Those first few sessions that we saw him working out again, training again, before the drugs really had a chance to kick back in again. And then obviously once they did kick back in, everything kind of took off like a rocket from there. So while we can't make super conclusive judgments with this information, because it is assumed that Lou had not just taken that previous year off from the drugs, but he'd also taken pretty much a full year off from training altogether as well. So his losses were most likely greater than they would have been if he had continued training with weights, even in the absence of the drugs. But either way, the profoundness and the rapidity of his regression is enough to make any sane person with no conflicts of interest conclude that these drugs do more than help the strength and muscular progression of an individual just a little bit or just a modest bit. Right? And obviously there's going to be variance across individuals, but in somebody like this and somebody like Lou, especially when they're kind enough to show us the juxtaposition of on versus off so very clearly, it does become very clear that they have benefited from these drugs by orders and orders of magnitude that the kind of powers that be would rather have us not believe was really something that happens. And then moving on to our very own Pete Rubish. And Pete's actually commented on this channel several times. So if you're watching now, Pete, what's up, man? I got nothing but love for you and nothing but respect for you as well, especially with your willingness and transparency, your willingness to show us all your whole journey here from the crazy strong deadlifter, the teen phenom, to the much more calculated and much more natural Pete that we see today. You are a true inspiration, my friend, and I hope that you're doing well. And for those of you who somehow don't know, Pete Rubish started out lifting crazy weights in his parents' basement when he was just a young teen. I don't know exactly when he started dabbling with steroids, but I do believe that it was pretty early on in the game for him, and he's always been pretty open about it as well, right? Now, flash forward a few years past his basement days, his deadlifts in the basement days, and he became a freaking monster who actually ended up deadlifting 920 pounds in the gym, a lift that Nick Wright highlighted on his channel, which was awesome. And if you haven't seen it, you should go check that lift out. But then not too long after Pete hit his monstrous peak with that 920 pound deadlift, he decided to go the natty route, right? He actually came off steroids completely, altogether. He's not on TRT. He's not on anything. He's come off them completely. And he documented his journey of coming off, of becoming natty once again, pretty much every step of the way on his YouTube channel, the ups and the downs as well. And it's something that he's still doing now. And in some of his most recent training footage, he hits a solid deadlift single with 633 pounds. It's clean and it's strong. It's impressive. And honestly, I wish that I could do that right now too. But having said all that, 633 pounds is a far, far cry from 920 pounds. And to my knowledge, Pete has never stopped training all of this time. He has simply come off of the drugs. And from what I've seen, his training has actually become much more calculated and well thought out in recent years than it ever was when he was pulling those insane 900 plus pound deadlifts. But in spite of that, he has experienced a pretty gnarly loss in strength of nearly 300 pounds off of his favorite exercise, his favorite lift. That is a decrease of over 30%, which is pretty enormous. Further than that, Natty Pete looks like he's Enhanced Pete's teenage son. He looks like he's half as big and half as old, even though he's like 6 years older now than he was in his strength prime. He's basically the real life Benjamin Button. So again, with this overly obvious, glaring juxtaposition, practically dick slapping us in the face with his big old foot-long schlong, it becomes pretty hard to take it seriously when a dude who's roided to the gills tells us that steroids don't help all that much. Just a little bit. But anyway, that's just how I see it, and I'm not really responding to anyone in particular here, so don't try to, get overly guessy with who I'm talking about. I'm really just kind of responding to the general vibe. And like I said, I'm not a data analyst or an exercise scientist or a researcher or a doctor of any sort. I'm just a dude who's got 2 eyes, maybe 4 or 5 brain cells to rub together every now and then. So take this assertion however you want. But from where I'm sitting, the power of these substances is actually quite profound, and anyone who tells you otherwise is probably either trying to sell you something or boost their own ego, or maybe a little bit of both. So next time you suspect or even know that somebody is on PEDs and they start downplaying the potential strength and hypertrophy impact that these drugs can have, they start talking about how the impacts of them are only really modest at best, perhaps it's best to take what they're saying with a big old hunkin' grain of salt, or maybe a few big old hunkin' grains of salt. If the impact were really that insubstantial, then the use of these substances would not be quite so prolific, would it be? Legality concerns and all that notwithstanding as well. And more people would be willing to come off of them altogether, as Pete Rubish has done, because the potential negative health ramifications of long-term usage are also just as real as the positive strength and hypertrophy impact. But it seems like the positives tend to often outweigh the negatives for most people in the fitness industry, and that's because the impact that they have, the positive impact that they have for those people, is likely much more substantial than most enhanced guys would like to have you believe. Just saying.